our world is becoming more dangerous and not less. I stress that. Europe is at war, the biggest war since the Second World War. We cannot avoid that. And also, you cannot win a war like this, particularly as it advances into the domains of cyber and space and so forth, by just having a standing armed force. It requires an all of society approach, every one of us understanding what we need to do to help defend our country better. And that mindset isn't there yet. And I stress it will probably take a major event for the penny to finally drop. That the West is so risk averse in dealing with the challenges that are coming over the horizon, that our global order is starting to crumble as adverse states, authoritarian nations start to group together to determine a different direction of where our world should go. We really do need to wake up, because otherwise we will lose control of the agenda of where our security is going.
We have Tobias Elwood here, who is a former Defence Minister and Conservative MP, and of course no stranger to Times Radio, to ask about this story. Hi, Tobias.
Good morning to you.
Good morning. So how concerning is this to you, and how surprising are these figures to you? Or were they figures that you were kind of well aware existed?
The figures as a threshold need to be placed into context. We train our armed forces at an incredibly high standards, and injuries do take place. So you're always going to get a percentage that aren't able to fight on that particular day. The concern I have is that these numbers are increasing. The numbers of people that aren't ready to fight are getting larger at the same time that our armed forces are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And we normally pride ourselves on the high standards in our military. That's absolutely right. And it's an admission by the defense minister that 1/5 of our personnel are not fit to fight, and that will concern the general public. 2025 is going to certainly be more dangerous than 2024. Our world's becoming increasingly more volatile as global order continues to erode. That does mean we're going to place extra burdens on all three forces as well. And yet here there is another warning from the MOD about the concerning state of our military. We need to invest more because we are struggling to meet the growing demands that we place on them. So we need to recognize this delta, this gap between the size of our armed forces and the threat picture that we face. And this is, I think, a struggle of finances between the MOD that understands that they need to move to 3%. NATO is now discussing that. Donald Trump will demand it when he gets into office to say, Europe, you need to do more to protect your own security. But the Treasury has yet to wake up. And I hope the British public will place ever greater emphasis on politicians to say, look, where's our world going? In the next 5 years, it's going to get very difficult indeed. Do we need to wait for an acute event, a massive cyber attack over London, before we finally see defense spending rise and we can then invest in our personnel as we should be doing right now?
And one of the questions that I have on this is that we don't necessarily know exactly what the reasons are for these serving members of the armed forces not necessarily being able to fight. And one of the questions that comes out of this story on the front page of this morning's Times is the need for greater information about the problems that they face in order to be able to say, well, actually, we need investment in, for example, physiotherapy. How much of a gap in this knowledge do you think we actually have?
Yes, you're right. I think we should let the MOD not micromanage the MOD as such, but definitely, you mentioned physio. I remember at Sandhurst when I went through the training academy there, everybody was getting injured so frequently because we weren't really ready for this high tempo of physical stress that suddenly we became under. But we soon adapted, and therefore you do have to take people with you, whether it be mental or physical stress. There needs to be the facilities available there to support our personnel. Where I'm concerned straight away is actually to do with the Navy. When we have 3,000 sailors out of only about 30,000 that cannot go to sea under any circumstances at this moment, it does mean that you could have an example of a senior engineer unable to allow a frigate or destroyer to even leave the port simply because the work that he or she does is so critical that without them, the ship cannot be deployed. And that means our overall defense posture is changing because we haven't got the personnel, the threshold of personnel that includes the aspect of having some, recognizing that some may not be fit to fight on any particular day.
Can I ask you about this speech that the Veterans Minister gave, where he said that the entire army would be killed or wounded within 6 months to a year of war with an adversary like Russia. Obviously, Number 10 said to be quite frustrated about that, but some might say, well, actually, that's not necessarily the best way of measuring the army's strength, given that if you look at the big political stories of the last year, perhaps a desire to avoid wars is potentially one of them. And actually, what we do see in this morning's Times is indications that for training purposes, we could see troops in the western Ukraine, but perhaps we're not necessarily speaking about this issue in the right way.
It's interesting that you use that phrase, avoid war. I mean, this is exactly how people were speaking in 1937, 1938. We must avoid war. When you avoid war, you actually give space for the bully to win. And that's what we're seeing in Ukraine right now, that we did not do enough to support Ukraine, to help push Russian forces back. And Putin is allowed to then fight another day as a deal looks pending indeed. Our world is becoming more dangerous and not less. I stress that. Europe is at war, the biggest war since the Second World War. We cannot avoid that. And also, you cannot win a war like this, particularly as it advances into the domains of cyber and space and so forth, by just having a standing armed force. It requires an all of society approach. Every one of us understanding what we need to do to help defend our country better. And that mindset isn't there yet. And I stress, it will probably take a major event for the penny to finally drop, that the West is so risk averse in dealing with the challenges that are coming over the horizon, that our global order is starting to crumble as adverse states, authoritarian nations start to group together to determine a different direction of where our world should go. We really do need to wake up, because otherwise we will lose control of the agenda of where our security is going.
And on that point of Ukraine, can I just ask you about that particular question of whether we should send British troops to Ukraine to train them rather than training Ukrainians here? Do you think that's a good idea? We should be doing more of that?
Yes, I really don't have a problem with that. And it's another illustration of how there needs to be, every time we come out with another pushback against Russia, there's a massive public debate about it and a concern that we'll lose control of the escalatory ladder. Let the military do their work. Let us work with Ukraine. When we discussed about NLAWs, anti-tank weapons, then whether we should send main battle tanks to Ukraine, whether we should send long-range missiles, a massive public debate, each time spooked by Putin's rhetoric. If we want Ukraine to win, we need to be doing everything we can in our power to give Ukraine the support they require. And if that includes that troops go there to train and so forth, so be it. I'd even go further and create a no-fly zone over Ukraine, in the same way that we protected Israel when incoming Iranian missiles and drones were heading towards Jerusalem, Tel Aviv. We then intervened. Why can't we do the same to protect Ukrainian civilian infrastructure and civilians themselves by helping with their airspace? Instead, as I say, we're allowing Putin to fight another day. And what sits behind Putin is, of course, China. And this is the wider world of what we need to wake up to, of where direction the travel is going. But we're so obsessed with domestic matters at the moment. It's distracting. And that's, I'm afraid, our adversaries are taking full advantage of that.
And do you think, finally, sorry, I know I just said finally before, but I do have one more question for you, which is that we did, of course, hear from Keir Starmer on this indication of British troops to train forces in Ukraine. But also before that, a few days before, we heard from former Ukrainian defense minister, I think it was, that Britain was not actually taking a leading role in protecting Ukraine in the way that Conservative predecessors have done. Do you think that's a fair assessment of this new government, or do you think actually that they are providing leadership in as much as the predecessors were?
I would urge caution on that. I would say I don't want this to become party political and who's supporting the Ukrainians the most. Britain has a very proud record from the very start. I've just rolled out a whole series of things where we hesitated, and yet it was Britain, when I say we, the West, hesitated in giving Ukraine the support. You remember at the very start, we were talking about whether we should send defensive or offensive weapons. And again, that just played into Putin's mindset of him spooking us. It was Britain that actually pushed the envelope every single time, even encouraging the Americans to send F-16s and main battle tanks. So we can be very, very proud of that. I hope we don't get into this silly debate of whether the Tories or Labour has done better or worse. That argument itself just allows Putin to smile and recognize that we are arguing amongst ourselves rather than joining together and realizing what the threat is and that we should be united in challenging it.
Tobias, thank you. And just finally, how are you spending your Christmas?
I'm here in beautiful Bournemouth, about to go for a walk on the seafront with the family and so forth. So delighted to have a quieter Christmas. If I may, my final point is just pay tribute to all the armed forces that I know will be on duty, many of them around the world, watching our backs, allowing us to sleep at night. They do an incredible job, but they will be away from their families. And I think it's just worth a nod to say thank you for what they do.
Certainly. Tobias, thank you very much for joining us. That was Tobias Elwood, former Defence Minister and Conservative MP there.